Hello everybody and welcome back to lecture. In the next few weeks we're going to spend a little bit of time moving into some of the more radical criminological theories that we have, and these theories are going to focus on crime as a result of sort of the social structure that we find ourselves in, and that crime is basically an inevitable outcome based on that structure, or it's a product of that structure rather. Um, Really what it's saying is that there's sort of no other way for people to behave, or there's no other way for things to go other than to get engaged in crime as sort of a way to circumvent that system that people find themselves in. And this week what we're going to do is begin with conflict theory, and conflict theory is centered around the idea that people commit crimes based on or because of underlying social and economic issues. So for example, people steal food from a store, or you know, they're stealing from the store because family members are hungry, or they kill people because there's no other way to make a negative situation better. Maybe I'm being abused, something like that, so I strike back and I kill for that purpose. So they see the murder of that particular person as a way to help society as a whole. In other words, conflict theory sort of proclaims that crime occurs as a result of a perceived or a real personal or group conflict. So my actions are a way to assert and even regain power in a situation in which I typically have none. Traditionally, we're socialized to understand the value that law holds, and that certain behaviors are considered right and wrong. There's a strong black and white for the most part for some behaviors, right? Law is established as a way for us to be able to control our behaviors and punish us when we violate the rules. However, sometimes laws are created in a more purposeful way to keep certain groups down. This is the portion of the argument that I know some of you will get upset with, or maybe even a little bit outraged by the idea, but keep in mind that I am not the originator of these ideas or these arguments. I am the messenger who passes the information on to you. But I will agree that these theories and these arguments have some merit. But think primarily when we're going down this avenue, one of the examples that I always like to discuss is the idea of the war on drugs. These laws were not passed because middle-aged white men were the ones who needed to be controlled. These laws were passed because young, radical, primarily minority Americans were perceived to be getting out of hand in the 1960s and 70s, and the Nixon administration did not like this. Later in the 1980s, with the Reagan era expansions, minorities were sort of once again targeted through the implementation of mandatory minimum prison sentencing, specific policing practices, and really through the big daddy of them all, the powder crack cocaine sentencing ratios. And the powder crack cocaine sentencing ratios, they've sort of been resolved a little bit, and we'll talk about that later as to how they have done that. But for the most part, these ratios, this might be something that you remember from earlier classes, especially if you're coming out of a CJ major. The powder to crack cocaine ratios were 101, or 100 to 1 rather. For decades, this was the sentencing ratio that the courts were sort of using when sentencing powder and crack cocaine. So of course, the one part of that ratio is the powder, and the 100 part, or I'm sorry, the one part of that is the crack portion, and the 100 part is the powder portion. So what you would be sentenced equally for 1 gram of crack or 100 grams of powder cocaine. But pharmacologically, there's no difference at all between the drugs. Crack is simply powder cocaine that has been cut and cooked down until it has been crystallized into rock form. And this allows the user to either then inject it or smoke it, whichever is their preference. But by injecting or smoking, it causes the user to get high quicker than powder cocaine, and which is a drug that is primarily snorted. And when you snort cocaine, it often takes longer to get into your bloodstream than it does when it is smoked or it's used intravenously. And one of the other differences that exists between crack and powder cocaine is the purity and the price of the drug. So powder cocaine is the pure substance in comparison to crack, which I already said is normally cut with something and then cooked down. So when it's cut, it might be with baking soda, it could be with powdered milk. In some instances, we've seen it cut with quinine, and in other cases, we've seen it even cut with further illicit substances. And when that occurs, that causes trouble because you often don't know what is in your crack, and then you're somehow compounding different illicit substances, which can cause a very severe and different reaction than the one you were after. But long story short, drug dealers really created crack and then expanded the crack market as a way to make a cheaper version of the drug, which then allows it to become a mass market drug. Powder is much more expensive to use and therefore is only really available to certain users who have the money to be able to engage in that type of drug use. But when crack really flooded the market, it flooded the market because of its inexpensive pricing. And its inexpensive pricing was very appealing to people who were part of low-income neighborhoods. And really, when we're talking about low-income neighborhoods, we're really talking about minority neighborhoods. And therefore, they're the more likely users of crack compared to powder users who are predominantly of a higher SES bracket and predominantly are white. But we have this market flooded with crack, and it's really getting into the inner city neighborhoods, and that is the drug that is becoming the bigger concern for lawmakers at the time. The dime bag users are taking precedent over the powder cocaine users who are using a drug that for the same weighted substance can often cost 10 to 30 times more for the same amount of product. But lawmakers saw crack as the issue, and they put legislation into place that would essentially sentence crack and powder cocaine users to the same amount of prison times for what is essentially two vastly different amounts of product. So I told you before the ratio was 1 to 100. So 1 gram of crack cocaine was equivalent to 100 grams of powder cocaine. So like I said, I'm sure you've heard this ratio before. It was just a crazy, absurd type of sentencing differential. And because of the way the law was written, unfortunately, more minority individuals were targeted compared to white individuals. So whether or not that's purposeful, you can go back and listen to some of the transcripts that the Nixon administration talked about when they created the War on Drugs and they created the Controlled Substance Act. And you can tell me whether or not you think some of these laws were purposeful. I have my own opinions, of course. But anyway, in 2010, the Obama administration worked very hard to make sure that the crack and powder cocaine sentencing differential was sort of narrowed, and it wasn't completely eliminated, but we went from a ratio of 1 to 100 to 1 to 118. 1 to 18. So the disparity is still there, but it has been lessened significantly. And one of the arguments a lot of people say is, well, crack is just generally more addictive compared to powder cocaine, and that is simply not true. You just get high faster, and but then the high sort of also wears off a little bit quicker, which is why people keep coming back to it in comparison to powder. So anyway, we have this new expansion of the law that significantly shrinks the sentencing differential, but what does it actually accomplish? The prior law that established the 1 to 100 ratio and the new law that shrunk the ratio to 1 to 18, both of those are still punishing both types of drug users. But it created a differential in which whites were treated differently than low-income minority drug users who were known to use crack cocaine much more so than whites. So you have a differential in how people are sentenced and how people are treated in the court system simply based on the same pharmacological drug, just in different formats. So that's conflict theory, right? We're being punished differently for using a pharmaceutically identical drug because those in power are part of the demographic that is more likely to use powder cocaine over crack cocaine. This is a perfect example of conflict theory in action. As Quinney suggests, law is the product of those in power and those who have a vested interest in controlling certain behaviors. It's a similar reason for why marijuana is still illegal at the federal level. As you know, marijuana has a variety of different medical uses, even though they are not formally recognized by the FDA, that help with pain relief, the prevention of seizures, and invigorating the appetite in many cancer patients. However, marijuana is a naturally growing substance. It does grow in the wild. We can individually grow it, even though that is illegal, but it's a naturally occurring substance, and that sheer fact alone puts it at direct odds with many of the medications that Big Pharma produces. So as you can imagine, Big Pharma makes a big campaign contribution to certain politicians, and we don't see any progress on any sort of federal legislation that would legalize marijuana. This is happening because Big Pharma has no desire to make marijuana legal at the federal level. If they do so, they then have competition, and they have a more naturally growing competition that is way, way, way less addictive than many of the drugs that Big Pharma produces. So Big Pharma has a vested interest in keeping marijuana on the illegal side of things. But Big Pharma also has big money, a lot of power, and a lot of control, and they're pushing the agenda that they want to see happen, and they can do so because they are in the pockets of specific politicians. So if we take this as an example, we could then make the stretch to other types of large organizations that have a strong vested interest in other more recent controversial issues that we've been seeing pop up in the news. And I'm not going to go into it, but you can probably make the stretch as to where I'm going with that example. But laws and policies are really seen to be formulated with the best interest of the wealthy in mind, and we see through the formation of law a very clear separation between these types of people and the poor. Laws are made in such a way that it makes the survival of low-income people of low economic status very difficult at times, and it seems to almost push them in the direction of criminal behavior at times. So when we see more and more and more restrictions being introduced, and people have to choose between getting their basic needs met and actually breaking the law, some will almost always choose to get their basic needs met and survive, even if that means they will have to face eventual legal repercussions and punishments. But according to conflict theory, people of lower economic status commit crimes merely to survive, not because they're vengeful, not because they want to see retribution, not because it's something that's just fun to do. For many people in this situation, it's all about survival. And if these people had the means that people of higher socioeconomic statuses had, they wouldn't not be committing these crimes because they wouldn't have a need to. This theory indicates that all crime has social and economic basis. Those theorists who prescribe to this particular school of thought really believe that society thrives upon competition and conflict between incompatible values and interests. And these incompatible values and interests are really at the root cause of crime. Crime would be non-existent or next to non-existent if this competition and conflict did not exist between the classes. The biggest extra-legal variable that exists in conflict theory is race. And right now there is a ton of racial conflict that we're seeing throughout this country, specifically regarding community member perceptions of the police and their effectiveness in doing their jobs. There has been a large focus on the Black Lives Matter movement and on police shootings involving unarmed black men in particular. This week, in addition to your regular textbook readings, you're going to focus on two competing readings that examine the Black Lives Matter movement from a conflict perspective. The first one, the Nix reading, focuses more on the policing aspect of things and how to prevent future shootings. And the second one offers a competing argument that centers on police bias in direct relation to race. As you read these, I want you to be thinking of things through a conflict lens and how the recommendations help with those in power and those who lack it. This week's lecture was rather short because I don't want to keep hitting you too hard with too much radical criminology over the next few weeks. Next week, we're going to take a look at Marxist and critical criminology together, and the week after that, we will look exclusively at feminist criminology on its own. Next week is all about the traditional Marxist ideologies that focus around the power dynamics that exist within an economic class structure. So meet me back here next week when we tackle Marx head on. I thank you for your time and your attention today. If you have any questions, as always, please let me know. And if not, I hope you guys have the rest of your day, and I'll see you next week. Thanks. Bye.